Hi, I'm Doug. I'm tech support representative here at Atlantic British. In this video we're going to talk about a coil spring replacement kit that we have for the LR3s that is designed for LR3s now, as everybody has been adding steel bumpers and roof racks and additional weight to them, and they find the original suspension really isn't designed for it, or if you're going to switch to coils and get the regular coil springs, they're not heavy enough to hold the vehicle up, or at least not give you a proper ride. So what we have is a heavy duty set, which is our L319 SRK OME-HL. The OME representing Old Man Emu coil springs. These are a good heavy duty spring, and what these will do is unloaded, it will actually raise the vehicle about 2 inches above its normal ride height and give you a much higher loading capacity. Very nice kit, and essentially what you're going to get is 2 of these for the front. You can see by the size of the coils, these are pretty massive, and these are definitely designed for heavy duty use. And the other will be 2 of the rears. As you can see, even heavier yet, with a good shock absorber built in and a protective boot. You'll also get new nuts for the top of these where they install into the frame, and so it's nice to have new hardware. And then you'll also get a reflash unit, so if you're converting over from the air suspension to the coil springs, so that you don't have all the warning lights and everything coming on, it basically works its way around the ride level control module, so you won't get all the lights and the buzzers and everything else. So that's essentially the kit, and the installation is pretty much the same as our other coil spring kits, but we're going to give you a little rundown and show you how to install it. Alright, so we're going to begin by doing the fronts, and you'll see that we've already taken the engine shield off, and that's just nothing more than the 4 10mm nuts and the oil filler cap, and that comes right out. The reason we're doing that is because we're going to access the inner nut on the 2 fronts from the top, as opposed to trying to get at it from underneath. If you look at it from underneath, you'll see it's almost impossible to get at. And what you can do is remove this inner shield, which will give you access with a universal socket and a long extension. You can get right down on the nut. So to take this out, you have a Phillips screw right here up top, and that's all that essentially holds that shield in place. At the bottom of the shield there's just 2 long tabs that go into 2 slots, so you can grab that, pull that sideways, and pull that right up and out. And if the clip comes out with it, or if it doesn't, don't worry about it, it won't go back in. Alright, so dead center in your screen you can see the nut, and it's a lot easier to access from here than it will be from underneath. So from here, with a long 3/8 drive extension and a 15mm deep swivel socket, you'll be able to get on that nut and take that off. Now that we've got the inside nut off, we have 2 more on the outside, one right here and one right here. Now, something I'll mention now, and maybe should have mentioned it earlier, before you do this, or if you plan on doing this on a weekend or whatever, during the course of the week, it really doesn't hurt to get some good penetrating oil and start pre-lubing these, like even a couple days ahead of time. Soak them down a little bit, let them sit. Do that once or twice during the week, and then when you get to your project, one more time, and you would not believe how much easier it is to get them off, especially in areas where there's salt content on the ground. It's a lot of states that salt during the winter, or if you live anywhere along the coast and you're dealing with that sea breeze, you get a lot of rust under there. So you've got 2 15mm nuts. I have a long extended 15mm wrench. It's great for just breaking those loose. Once you break them loose, you should be able to just get up in there with a ratcheting box wrench and work them right off. Alright, so we have the top nuts are out. What we're going to do now is we're going to run out the bottom bolt. I have the advantage of an air impact, so, but those of you that don't, you can get them off by hand. You have a 15/16 nut with a 21mm head bolt that runs through the very bottom. And what we're going to do essentially is, when we run the bolt out, we're going to let this drop a little bit, and this unit can only expand as far as the shock absorber travels, so you don't have to worry about it. It's not going to come apart on you or when you lower it and when you take the bolts out. And what we're going to do for that reason is to drop it down just far enough where we'll be able to spin it and be able to access the airline and take the airline off the top of the air strut. Alright, so we've lowered this down a little bit and we've turned it so that we can bring the nut around to the front. That's a 12mm nut on the airline. And what we're going to do is we'll just back that off about 3 or 4 turns until you start hearing a hissing noise. We're going to let the air strut bleed down on its own, So it'll be a good time to go grab a coffee or a soda or whatever. Take maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and then once you hear the hissing stopped, you know all your air pressure is done, and then we'll take the airline off. Alright, so right now we've got that backed off. It's bleeding down. You can hear it. And we'll let that go for a couple minutes. So, we've taken the airline off. In fact, as soon as we did that, shock unit dropped down. As I said, this can't expand or come apart or whatnot. The shock absorber holds the airbag in place. This is now deflated. So, what we're going to do to get it out of there, you'll notice the bottom area where the bolt ran through is running, say, from 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock position. We're going to turn that to a 6 and 12 o'clock. So it fits up through that opening in the lower control arm, and it comes right up and out of there. So there's your complete air shock assembly. So at this point now we're going to install the new one, and what we're going to do is set up the orientation so that the bottom bushing is lined up as close as possible with the bolt hole in the lower control arm. And they're not always exact, but it can be moved and adjusted to get it to fit in place. Also, if you're worried about the airline, we just push that up through the hole, let it sit on top. It's not going anywhere. It's supported by a clip that's only like about 6 inches down the airline. It's not going to make any noise. It's not going to create any undue problems. So we're just going to push it up and out of the way and leave it up there. It'll be just fine. So let's get the new one up in place. Alright, so we know that we've got a single bolt dead center in the back, and that we want to end up with the bolt at the bottom ending up at about a 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock position. So first thing we do is when you get your kit, there's going to be a new nut on each one of the studs. Take the nuts off. Take at least one and have it within arm's reach, because when we set this up in place and push it up through, we're going to at least try to get one nut on there to hold it, and then it makes it easier for the other two. Also, you'll see here where we have the bottom is at 3 and 9, and we have the single bolt in the front. So if we turn that around, we now have single bolt in the back and the bottom bushing in line. So this is the way we're going to install it in the vehicle. So what we've done is we've set it up in place, got the 3 studs that go up through the hole. I put the nut on the forward stud because the one in the back and the one to the rear of the vehicle has a bracket support that pops over those studs, and it's really hard to support this and line that up and put the nut on. So you squeeze your hand in here, you put the new nut on the new stud, spin it down about 3 or 4 turns, and that'll hold everything in place. So now you can just reach in, wiggle that bracket around until it drops in place, and then we can put the 2 nuts on the rear and the inward stud. There we go, and that popped right in. Alright, so we're going to just tighten down the 3 top nuts. I'll get underneath and do these 2 here. This one to the rear, one to the front, and then we'll lower this down, do the one to the back, and then we'll show you how to set up the bolt on the bottom. If you're worried about a torque spec on the top nut, there's no way you're going to get a torque wrench up on these anyway, so all I can suggest is just make sure they're good and tight. Alright, so you'll notice that once you get the top bolted up and you got your bottom bushing lined up, you're going to see that the shock is actually going to extend a little bit past the lower control arm. Now, there's a couple different ways you can do it. First off, a nice long pry bar, 4-foot piece of 3/4 inch black pipe makes a good pry bar. I prefer an old Chrysler torsion bar, one of the best pry bars I've ever owned. And with another friend, to be able to leverage on this and be able to push down on the lower control arm, it may not go far enough to reach, where I find if you disconnect the sway bar link, take one of the top or bottom bolts out and just slide that out, you can get a little more travel out of it. Or if you're set up on a lift like this, what I can even do is put a jack stand underneath to support the spring of the shock absorber and lower the vehicle enough where this will compress and line up with the lower control arm, and I don't have to fool around so much with the suspension. So I'm going to do it that way just to get this in place. So with a little bit of maneuvering, we're able to get the lower bolt lined up. We drive the bolt through, put the nut on. At this point, we're not going to tighten it down yet. We're going to wait until we've got all 4 on. We're at the point where you have the wheels back on and set it down. If you have a drive up lift, that's great. If not, if you have a way of, imagine you have to get underneath the vehicle. But essentially what they call is neutralizing a bushing. In other words, set this down so that if you tighten it at this point, when you set the vehicle down, you're going to be taking that bushing and twisting it as the vehicle settles down into its ride height. So what you want to do is leave these loose, and when you get the vehicle on the ground, however it takes to get to it, that's actually the ideal point of tightening them up. If you have no other recourse and you need to tighten them up while it's up in the air, if you're up on jack stands, that's okay, it'll still work, but it's still better to neutralize it, and this way you won't end up with any bushing squawk afterwards. Alright, so now we got to the rear. Now the rear strut is really not much more than 3 15mm nuts on top, and then your long bolt across the bottom through the lower control arm, and your air line. So we'll start with the air line, and actually you can get at it on this one. The nut is up higher than the top support plate, so you can get a little 12mm wrench in there, and we'll do like we did with the fronts. We'll back it off about 4 or 5 turns, and until we hear it hiss, and then we'll just let that bleed out. It's always better to work on these when there's no pressure in the strut. Alright, now wait a couple minutes, we'll let that bleed out. So we bled out the line, and now we're going to remove the top 3 nuts. The 2 on the outside are fairly easy to get at, and usually they say, as I did with the front, I have a nice long extended 15mm. It's good leverage. So I essentially just use this one to crack the nut loose, and then I can get in there with a shorter wrench and end up zipping it out much easier. Now, the one in the back, however, what I would suggest first off is, if you wear a watch on your left hand, take it off, because it's a tight fit and you're going to scratch it all up on the top here. That nut is directly in the back, dead center, and you'll need a fairly short wrench to be able to swing it, to be able to get it in there, but it does come out, and there really is no access from the top. The body is directly over it, and again, no access. So we'll take those 3 out, and then we'll get to the bottom bolt. Alright, so we got the top 3 nuts out, and you'll find that back nut, you can get your hands wrapped around the back side of this, so you can actually sneak a ratcheting box wrench around the back side, and you got some swing room in there. So that was not so bad. Again, the outers are easy. We got the top loose. Now we're just going to zip that bottom bolt out, and then we'll be able to take that whole assembly right out of there. So just a note, the bottom bolt is the same as the front. You got a 21mm head on the bolt and a 15/16 nut. We zip the nut off, we got the bolt out. Now if you get to a point where the bolt gets about halfway out, kind of jammed up, it is a flange nut. In other words, it's sort of like a washer built into the head of it. What you can do is take that 21mm wrench open end and sneak it up behind the washer and hit it out with a hammer, and that will walk that bolt right out. Alright, so this is a little bit of a tight fit. Essentially what we want to do at this point, we're going to take this strut, turn it 90 degrees so that that base will fit up through the lower control arm to remove it. But you've also got to get this lined up where you have this bracket right here is going to hit this, so we want to line it up with this one lower spot. And this isn't light either, so up and out. So we're going to put the new unit in, but I would suggest, like at this point, take a little wire brush, a little sandpaper, clean up around the holes on the top, because you really don't want to put the new nuts and lock them down on a rusty area, because sometimes that can falsely think it's tight and end up leaving you when the rust breaks away, leaving the nut loose. So we'll just sand down a little bit right about the nut area. And you might even want to clean up inside the area that you're not going to be able to get at once you put the strut in there. Maybe some of the rust deterrent paints that are out there now. Maybe you want to shoot that in there before you put the strut in. So we're essentially just going to grab the new unit. We'll get this laid up in place, and it's a simple bolt-on operation, just like getting the old one out. Now you'll notice, if you look closely on the top, the 3 bolts are not equidistant. You've got 2 that are closer together than the third. This would be the one going in the back. So because of that, and the way they assemble these, this bottom hole may not line up exactly with the bolt hole in the lower control arm. You can easily take a piece of pipe, a long flat screwdriver, anything that'll fit in this hole, and with the top locked in place, you can turn this bottom to match the angle for the bolt hole and then install it at that point. Alright, now I will say it's a bit of a wrestling match, but you can get this in here. You want to try to orient it so that if you look at the base plate, there's two flat areas. One has a hole, one does not. The one with the hole I find fits best with that facing the upper control arm. That puts the orientation of the top studs in line, and it gets that bottom bushing very, very close to the angle it needs to be to put the bolt through. Again, you'll notice the strut is a little bit short from being able to get lined up with that hole. Again, you could do this with either a jack stand underneath or a floor jack, but all we need to do is raise that control arm up, or even a long bar underneath the upper and lifting would get it close, but it usually helps then you have a second person to run that bolt in. It's kind of tough to do by yourself. But you can get it in yourself. It can be done, obviously. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to snug down the top nuts. I want a little bit of movement right here down at the bottom. Once I get the bolt in, then I'll finish tightening the nuts. Alright, so we got the rear unit in, top nuts are tight, the bottom bolt is in, the nut is loose. As I said, what we're going to do is, as we mentioned in the front, once we get everything else done, we're going to set this down, and then once it's on its normal riding position, then we'll tighten down those bottom bolts on all four. So the next step, I guess, is going to be just to do the reflash, so to turn off all the warning lights and whatnot in the system, and that's relatively easy to do as well, and there's two different methods, and we'll show you how to do both. Alright, so I want to mention at this point now, this is a Sport with directional stability control, so we're going to leave the height sensors connected, but in the cases of some of the early LR3s and the Sports without directional stability control, more like you want to disconnect the electrical connector out of all four of the height sensors. So it gives you an idea of the location of the front, and then I'm going to now show you the rear, so that if you do run into a situation or you have a vehicle that where we would recommend you disconnect, you know where the component is. Alright, and so now this is the location of the rear. So now you know when we mentioned height sensors, you know exactly where they are. So we have all four all bolted up now. Don't forget to put your heat shields back in and your engine cover. And then what we're going to do then is we're going to go through a run through just to get you familiar with the reflash procedure. So when you're done converting your Sport or your LR3 over from air suspension to coil spring, you're going to need to do what's referred to as a reflash or an inline filter, basically to fool the system so that it'll turn off all the warning lights and the bells and whistles and everything else will operate. What it also does is it also maintains terrain response, so you don't lose that, which is nice. The only thing you do lose is the ability to raise and lower the vehicle at will. So essentially what you'll be receiving is an EAS reflash unit, referred to this as the 7980. It comes with the box. You'll also have a plug-in pigtail. It's got 6 wires off of it that will need to be wired in. We're going to show you how to do that in a few minutes, and that's essentially it. And then through a small process, it will be able to reflash this unit so that you can drive away without having all the warning lights on. So we're going to start off with showing you how to access and where the location of the ride level control module is, because the wiring going into that module is where we're going to be cutting into and splicing into to make this work. Alright, so we have the vehicle started, and you can see the warning lights you have on: red brake light, the ABS light, the steering angle sensor, the suspension light, and all those are related, especially on these newer vehicles with these networks where they all talk to each other. So now you've seen the lights. Now we're going to show you the terrain response, which the lights are out because it also sees a fault there. Alright, so here's your terrain response selector on the center console, and you'll see I'm going to move this bright light away just for a second, and you can see there are no indicator lights on that, so you've essentially lost terrain response. We're going to go through the reflash and get that back. Alright, so to get started, we're going to need a few basic tools: a straight blade screwdriver, Phillips screwdriver. I would prefer you use a nylon trim tool as opposed to metal, and then a 1/4-inch drive ratchet extension. Now this is a 10mm deep swivel head. You can go with a regular deep with a shorter extension. This is just the setup I like to use, and an 8mm deep 1/4-inch drive socket. So you start off with taking the straight blade, and we're just going to stick that underneath that. This is your footrest. This pops right off. Now what that does is that exposes two 10mm nuts that are going to hold this foot pad in place. So we grab our 1/4 ratchet, And the reason I go with the deep is because you've got probably about 3/4 of an inch of stud passes the nut. So a regular socket may be a little too shallow to get all the way on the nut to get it off. So we got one. Oh, also one more tool you're going to need is going to be a T25 Torx driver. There's a Torx head bolt that holds the hood release lever on. You're just going to simply take that bolt out and the lever pops right off. So we'll take that Torx head screw out of there. And we'll slide that lever right off. And we grab the foot pad. And I need to wiggle a little bit, and that comes straight up. Now you'll notice you got a big flat tab right here and an open slot right here. So when we put this back together, you just remember, put that tab in the slot, and this is actually going to help hold this kick panel in place. Stash that down underneath. So the next step is going to be, we want to take this kick panel off. To do that, we got to pop up the door sill. That's where the nylon trim panel comes in handy. Just get up underneath it and lift. That pops right up. And a little trick I like is when you want to keep this out of the way, just grab your seat belt and wrap it twice around that. That'll keep that up and out of the way for you. Alright, so now we're going to grab our weather strip and we're just going to pull that away. And now we can just grab the bottom of this, pull it towards you, it'll pop right out. And we'll set that down. So as you can see now, we're gaining access. So the next step, with a Phillips screwdriver, there's 2 Phillips screws underneath that hold this upper kick panel. You're going to grab the piece of carpeting that's over on the far side on the center console. We pull that. And we got to drop this down far enough so that we can get to our courtesy light. And that connector, you can just grab the back of the connector and give it a quick pull out. It snaps right out. And we get that out of the way. And then last but not least, so you can get your hand in there, this lower panel right here actually just has 2 clips on top that holds that in place. Drop that down a bit, slide it right out. So we'll move all this stuff out of our way. So now we've got full access. Now the ride level control module, we're going to give you a better view in just a second, is actually up and high up on this kick panel on the left hand side. So if you have a Sport that is equipped with directional stability control, that module actually sits just below the ride level module. It's sitting right here. Now that's going to have 2 8mm bolts. Heads are 8mm. You're going to take those off and get that out of the way, and you can actually get your fingers up in there and pull the 2 connectors that you need to remove out of the ride level module to access and install the reflash tool. So we're going to give you a little better view of that in just a second, and then we're going to drop this lower module out of the way. Now you see up high, you'll see a row of connectors, and that is the bottom of the ride level control module. And it's just a little tab in the center of each connector that you can just squeeze in with your forefinger and then grab with your thumb and your middle finger and slide that connector right out. So you can reach up inside and you can disconnect the 2 connectors that you need to access this, and you'll see that there is a little squeeze tab right there, and that'll be facing the outer, so you can actually get your finger on that. Now this is the connector that, if you're looking up at the ride level control module, is going to be to the rear of the module. It's the very last one, which would be towards the back of the vehicle. This is the one where it has the data wires and the power circuit that you're going to use to be able to connect this. Now as you see, we already have a harness connected. In the directions that you receive with that, you're actually going to be told you got certain wires that have to go to certain locations, so you got to be very careful that they definitely have to be installed in that order. And what that will do is create a loop through the filter and partially bypass the ride level control module to sort of fool the system. So that's essentially what it's going to look like when it's done. And then the second connector, which is towards the front side of the module, is where the ground wire is going to be connected, and that's also shown in the instructions exactly what pin, exactly what location. With these connectors, if you're not familiar with them, there is a little instruction sheet in the envelope. It shows you exactly how to attach each one. You want to make sure you have a good secure connection on all 4 of them. This way you'll end up with no interference on your data link, which this is essentially the circuit that all the modules talk to each other on. So we want to make sure we have a good solid connection. And that's essentially it. We're just going to be cutting 2 wires, and so making 4 splices, and then attach a ground wire, attach a power circuit, and you're essentially done as far as hooking up this pigtail. Now, once you've done that, I'm going to plug this in, and the instructions are going to tell us to turn the key on. So you'll see these flipping back and forth. There's your orange and green lights, and this is essentially telling you at this point that the system is ready to accept a program. Alright, so before we even go any further, before we hook this up, before we tie everything up and actually go to do the reprogramming, make sure that your vehicle battery is up and fully charged with no less than 12 volts. Now at this point, as I said, we follow the instructions. It tells you what color wire to attach to what color wire at what location. Basically what you say in the instructions, it says ECU side. That refers to the side of the connector. When it refers to vehicle side, it's talking about the harness coming down out of the vehicle. So we've got it connected. We've plugged it all back in. Battery's up at full charge. When you turn your key on, this is essentially what you should be seeing. The green light rapidly flashing, the orange light flashing once per second. Now, what you're going to do then to program this for coil is we're going to press this black button. You're going to hold it initially until, anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds, and the orange light's going to come on and stay on, and at that point you release the button. So we'll press and hold. There's our orange light. It's back to flashing. So at this point we should be programmed for air suspension. What we're going to do to verify that is we're going to look back on the center console, and the light for the vehicle height should be out. And that's telling you that we're in coil mode. Now, being this vehicle has ride level control and directional stability control, you'll notice the terrain response is out, because once in a while with these vehicles, when you do this process, it actually creates a disconnect in what's called lateral acceleration calibration. There's a couple calibrations that will need to be redone, which can be done with most of your Land Rover diagnostic tools. So we're going to do that so that we can regain our terrain response. Yep, suspension fault, vehicle light. Oh, you know what? This is good. Okay, so it does start. My four-way shouldn't be on though. Oh, okay. Must have hit that. Engine system fault. Alright, so you can see you're going to end up sometimes with some warning lights on this. And what we're going to do is now we're just going to hook up a basic analyzer. We're going to clear all the faults. Probably going to have to do a recalibration on that lateral acceleration, and that'll turn off the directional stability control warning light. It should turn our terrain response back on, which actually is already on. I've even found sometimes with just by going through several restarts and driving the vehicle, it'll clear that code out of there. So let's shut it down one more time. We'll wait a second. Now this warning where vehicle system leans, we're going to end up doing the recalibration. Okay, so we got one fault that's activating directional stability control, but terrain response is on, which is good. And we're in coil mode because our lights here are out. So let's clear out the codes and double check and make sure everything is good. Alright, so in many cases, even though you saw where terrain response was on, we had some codes that were showing up on here. Essentially, we did 2 or 3 restarts and the vehicle actually cleared the codes out all by itself. So I have no warning lights on, we have terrain response, we have our high-low management here for our traction or for our transfer case, and you'll notice that no lights here tells you that we are in coil mode. So we're actually good to go. So we're going to find a nice spot up in that upper area. We'll wire tie the box so that it's not hitting anything or rattling around under the dash, and simply just reverse your process or reassembly just the way you took it apart. Once that's done, you're ready to road test this and take it for a ride. Alright, so when you're ready to convert your Sport or your LR3 over from air suspension to coil spring, you can call any of our knowledgeable salesmen at 1-800-533-2210, or you can click on this link and order it online. And if you like our helpful videos, you can click on here and this will take you to our YouTube channel where you can subscribe and see our number of videos that we've produced. So we thank you for watching, and Rover on.